having me. I really do appreciate it. My goal is to share my thoughts around how to keep business simplified. And I've been in both big companies and startups, and right now I work with a lot of startups, and they share one thing in common, is that the more people you bring on and the more business you go after, the more complex you make your business. And that is only because tasks are supposed to generate outcomes, but too often the tasks become outcomes in and of themselves. And we were talking a little bit about, in our breakout, we were talking about working with the police and with government. And I find that with government, this is even more the case, is that it's not about accomplishing anything. It's about checking the box of what you're mandated to do. And that applies to not-for-profits as well. And I love quotes. And when we talk about things, Einstein said it best: if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I find that very true. And if you can't explain your business to someone, if you can't explain what you do very quickly and very easily, and if it's not relevant, resonant, and remarkable, as Rob and I were talking about, you probably don't know your business well enough. And that's what starts the complexification of business, is that people don't know enough about what the business is really trying to accomplish. So I break business into some fairly fundamental pieces, and it's important to understand this distinction. Is there's easy or simple and complex. So think of it as riding a bicycle. If you know how to ride a bike, it's simple. Flying a jet plane, a little bit more complex. Teaching somebody how to ride a bike might not be quite as simple or as easy. But then when you think about easy, well, it's easy to ride a bike if you know how. But what's difficult maybe is throwing a no-hitter or doing the Tour de France. So I think of the difference between easy and hard as if you've ever ridden your bike on a converted rail line where they've paved it over and it's very flat, very straight, versus the Tour de France. That's kind of the difference between the two. And that's where we start getting into the difficulties of business. One of the ways to refocus that was taught to me by this gentleman, and he's been out of the business a long time, but this man's name is Jeff Noddle. Jeff Noddle was the CEO of SuperValue, and I was there. Jeff was a very nice man, not the greatest CEO on the face of the planet. But he taught me that business can be simple no matter how big you get if you stay focused on three basic things. How do you drive top-line sales? And this gets kind of superseded by all the other tasks because it's hard to measure sometimes if your activity is actually driving top-line sales. The first thing that gets complex about it is people start focusing on bottom-line profitability, which you can measure. So that's the second thing to focus on. The third, and this one is used out of context all the time, and that's aggressively managing the expense line of your business. And if you remember offshoring and headcount cutting from years ago, this was when people said, this will simplify our business. And it didn't. It saved money, but it created all of its own complexities, which made life that much more of a challenge. So what happens as you start to increase complexity? The first thing that starts to happen is you'll notice that people start to firefight more. They react. They come in, they turn their computer on, they start reacting to the emails that are there. And if you sort your emails from the latest one coming in at the top of your inbox, you're probably solving some of the wrong problems because the original problem probably started earlier. So the idea of firefighting really creates complexity because we start reacting instead of thinking. And that creates problems inside and outside of an organization. The second piece is the discontinuity in messaging, in what to do, what are the priorities. So we start losing clarity around what should be done first, what should be done second, what should be done third. The third is poor communication. And I don't care what size company you are. I don't care if you're in the government or in not-for-profits. Poor communication is the root of most problems created inside of an organization. Because now we've got the three things that are bad: is bad communication, bad clarity, and firefighting, all creating this miasma of what do we need to do first, who's right, who's wrong. And then the final one that I throw in here is office politics. And having been a big company guy for a number of years, I thought that big companies were where politics really rested. Oh no, I was so wrong. The politics in small companies can be much, much worse because there's nowhere to hide in small companies. They're also bleed their way into government, strangely enough, because there's plenty of politics there. But it's just the who's responsible for what. And I could tell you stories about government agencies that all fall under one umbrella, that are all trying to do one thing, and they all do it differently and compete for the same customer. So this all comes together to create a mismatch in the outcomes that you want to achieve and the processes that you use to get there. So how then do we try and stay simple? And there's really two ways to do this to help drive the top line performance in any organization. And there's thankfully only two ways. And if we can stay focused on these, then we can start to really hold our salespeople accountable. The first one is traffic. No matter what kind of business you're in, top line sales get generated when you increase the amount of traffic. So you think of any type of retail store, the more people that come in, the more they likely buy. If you're a not-for-profit, the more clients you have, the more revenue you're going to generate. So that's kind of the first way. And the second way is increase your basket. And that's the amount of stuff that people buy once they're already shopping with you. And this can apply to a product company or a service company, because what I've observed with specifically not-for-profits is that they don't think about basket at all, and they don't think about attrition at all. So if you've got a client, find out, are they buying every single one of your products? And if not, how do you maximize the spend of that existing customer for their benefit? You don't want to take advantage of them, but you want them to be buying everything that you offer, because if they're not buying it from you, they're buying it somewhere else. So that customer value then can be increased by saying, look, we've got a better program here. And Scott, you were talking about the body cameras and car cameras. Well, if they're already doing all the stuff with recording, now you can say, look, I don't have to make a lot of money, but I can keep them in my fold and avoid having to go out and have them resource the business, because now I own more of their total spend. And we'll talk about a couple of metrics on that in just a moment. So why doesn't this happen? Why don't we stay focused on driving traffic and driving basket? What occurs that keeps us from going there? So I just want to, and we can put this in the chat, we can just talk about it, but I'm interested in hearing ways that you guys see driving traffic and driving basket. And I'll throw one out to kind of get you thinking about it. In almost every business, if you're not thinking about traffic, you're losing business right away, because there's always attrition. Somebody dies, somebody moves, somebody says, this is no longer for me. What are things that you guys see that should be used, or where you can go find more traffic or more customers?
I can throw one out there. In my line of work, the one number that I focus on is, I'm really good at creating a strategic plan, and I'm sure Ed, you can probably, you know exactly where I'm going with this, right? You can create the plan, but like we were talking about, Craig, there's things that happen in life that can derail you from the plan. And one thing we know at Jones, 74% of the clients that we serve would they have no idea that we sold life insurance to protect the plan. So just talking about life insurance when we're working with clients, letting them know that it's a full picture view that we give them. You're going to retain more clients, deeper engagement, better relationships. And So,
Yep. Yeah. So you're generating the traffic, and then the basket is that insurance piece of what part of your financial independence am I not helping you with? Oh,
yeah.
those are great ways to look at it.
Personally, I have looked at increasing the basket or increasing your basket, probably too much so in that I'm trying to look at too many different things, and it's baskets that I want to add on that we don't currently sell, I guess.
Yep.
And then it's interesting because I think I'm not staying simple. I'm complicating it by adding other products. Maybe I should stop doing that and stay simple. So especially for a small business, it's a difficult thing to do because you want to build on that basket without a doubt. Increase that customer spend, and we are trying to do that, but we're also trying to do that by adding on other products that is complicating the business.
Yep. And Scott, you and I could maybe talk, because I've got a couple of tools that I can share of different ways to look at where do you want to expand your basket. I was doing a project with a major company here in town where they wanted to grow their business, and they were looking at all these things all the way out there, and they were 1, 2, 3 generations away from their core product, and they weren't down any of their business strength pathways. So they were adding complexity without adding benefit. And there's different ways to go about that to make sure that, okay, if let's say recording is your core competency, what are those things that are 1 or 2 generations away from core competency? And from what you had said in our breakout, there was one that with the dictation and the ability to transcribe that. So now you've got recording and transcription, which now you could say, maybe I shouldn't even be looking in law enforcement. Maybe I should be looking, you mentioned medical. They have the same needs. How do I take what I want and go into another vertical that maybe I complexify my business in a different way? So no, those are good things to think about. Anybody else have any ideas before we move ahead?
Well, for another top line and playing off of Rob's idea, realistically, doing such a great job with your existing shopper that they want to turn to their neighbor or their friends and say, hey, I'm going to this store, come along with me, you might really like this.
Yeah, the whole customer experience concept of,
yeah, so bringing others in and allowing them to shop is going to impact your top line as well.
Yep. And those testimonials that, and I know Terry was, when Terry first came into the Minneapolis market and really started talking about neuroscience and neuromarketing, one of the big things he was looking for was testimonials, so that people realize that, oh, I know that person. If they liked it, Ed, to your point, maybe I'll check it out as well. And Terry was extremely effective at doing that, because he got everybody that he had met to ponder, should I write a testimonial? Did I get enough out of this to write a testimonial? So, no, all good stuff. All right, let's keep going. When we start talking about driving bottom line, this is where it gets a little bit more cerebral. And by that, I mean, you've got to start thinking about differentiators. And some of those differentiators is selling the product that generates the most dollar revenue always the best? Is selling something that makes you the most profit always the best? Is it something that has velocity? And there was something we used to use in the supermarket business called return on inventory invested, which is the ROII. And we would always compare commercial bread with greeting cards. Commercial bread was a high velocity, low margin business. Greeting cards, high margin, low velocity. So now you can say I can compare the two, and they were both were needed and both generated profit margin equally based on velocity and how much I made on each individual sale. Cross merchandising, how do you partner or pair things together? Scott, like we were talking about, the dictation and recording kind of are a coffee and coffee creamer type of thing. If they're buying one, the other one's a fairly normal extension. Loyalty, do we reward people that have been with us a long time? Think about whether it's cell phones or cable companies, who gets the better deals? New customers or people who have been around for 20 years? Make sure that your loyal customers have no reason to go out and seek something new. You still want to attract the new customers, but they've got to earn that loyalty. And then the PCR, PCW, these are two acronyms, and I hate acronyms, but I still use them because unfortunately they're a fact of life. PCR is something we used to use called purchase concentration ratio, which really means the amount of money that your client spends in your space and how much of it do they spend with you. And so if their budget is $100,000 and you know you only get 10,000 of it, you know that you're at a 10% PCR. You've got 90% of it that you still could get. And then the PCW is what we used to use to understand volume potential, because that's the per capita weekly expenditure in food. And we would use that to understand, given a population in a city, what should a grocery store be able to attract of all the money spent on a regular basis. So it's understanding both the full potential and what you're getting of it, and where do they have expandable consumption things where if they buy more, they'll use more. And so if you think of things like potato chips and cookies, those are expandable consumption. And we saw with bath tissue in the beginning of the pandemic, it's not really an expandable consumption. You don't, just because you have more doesn't mean you use more. So now you're stuck with all sorts of things you don't need. So you got to make sure you understand which products fall into which bucket. And then probably the most important metric as you're looking at overall performance is the absolute versus relative metric. And this is in finance all the time. And most businesses are driven by percentages. What's my gross margin percent? What's my expense percent? And I use this example because it brings it home for most people. If you have a mortgage on your home, I found, and you guys might have a different experience, most banks, Sean, you can jump in here if you guys do things differently, but most banks require you to write a dollar check for your mortgage. If you lose your job and your dollar check coming in goes down, they don't say, well, it's only a % of what you make that you have to send us. No, it's that making sure you understand that absolute amount, because you can fall into some traps. I used to do an exercise with folks where I'd show them how I could put a store out of business profitably by having them make a higher margin %, but actually lose money on every transaction. And it was a very sobering thing for them because they started identifying tactics that they would employ that actually did the same thing. I had one region of SuperValue, they started carrying a dollar store canned soup line that undercut all their Campbell sales. And I said, it's not expandable consumption. So you're actually putting your stores out of business by encouraging consumers to buy something at 3 for $1. They were buying at 2 for $1. So there's all sorts of things in here that can help you both get more complex, but if you teach people what they're about, they can really help you simplify your business. And we won't do this as an exercise, but I want people to start to think about, because especially as I've gotten older, I had to become a little bit more of a knowledge base in terms of how do you do some of these things using the digital economy. And I created this graphic, and it started out as just for me, but I found it's very useful with people to think about their business. And if you look at the colored squares kind of over here, that's the website. That's everything that your digital footprint online, and liken that to a physical location, because that's where you want people to go and learn and consummate their transaction. But all the digital tools, the stuff that's out over here on the left-hand side of the screen, those are all ways to drive traffic. And depending on who your customer is, you can use these different tools to help drive traffic. When you look at the red box on the bottom with custom landing pages, that's when you really understand your customer and you start saying, how do I drive my narrow market, the people that are ready to buy, to places that will actually encourage them to buy sooner? And there's a whole business model around building funnels to do this, to get them in to make a test purchase, to start giving you a little bit of money, and then start giving you more and more and more as you understand more of what they want. And then at the top, when you look at an email marketing strategy, that should be driven by two things. One is who's actually bought from you. So this goes back to the loyalty piece. How are you engaging the people that already buy from you? I helped a company in the pet technology space. They had sold 1,000 units in the beginning and had failed to sign up or get 700 of them to sign on to get online and start being used. So they had a transaction, but they had no way of saying, how do I keep those customers coming back and interested in my product? And then of course, if they don't buy, They were interested enough to go a long way with you in the purchase cycle. How do you keep them engaged until they are ready? And I did a project with Purina. Land O'Lakes owns Purina Feed. And their sales team would go out and call on farmers to try and get them to buy feed. Well, these farmers were typically using some other feed. And if you've ever worked with farmers, they're really reluctant to change until there's a crisis. But they didn't want to do any brand building stuff. They wanted to send somebody out there, and half the time it was dead windshield time to make sure they had the relationship with the farmer. But there's a different way to do that sometimes. So it's how do you blend the in-person with the informational with the brand building to get people moving forward. And then finally, the last simplification piece is really understanding the benefits of managing expenses. And Scott, this will play really well to government, and I don't know about law enforcement. I have to ask my brother-in-law. He's a retired sheriff from Ramsey County, but a lot of not-for-profits and a lot of government folks don't really understand the difference between efficient and effective. And so I use the hub and spoke method. This is really efficient. And we used to send people out, drive to an area and see all the clients in that area. That's incredibly efficient, but it's not always effective because the needs of the clients might be different. So when you look at an effective way to do things, this is an example from a legal company of how a service-based organization really would say, how do I create the most effective set of relationships? And this comes from a toolkit that I put together years ago called a top to top, which is how do you align with your strategic customers to really understand how do you build relationships at the right level to further protect your business. So when you start looking at expenses, start reviewing how do you go to market, and are you doing it solely for efficiency, or are you looking at how do we become effective? And a couple examples that I'll use here just to give you some flavor for this. How many people are familiar with Dollar General? Raise your hands, I'll see some of you, but I got to see some of the inner workings of Dollar General, and you know the way they build DCs is they build a market that's outside of where they work, and they start building stores. And they service those stores out of existing distribution centers until they achieve a volume level and they overcome a cost per mile of distribution, because then they can become effective in a marketplace before they create the efficiency of building another DC there. And the presentation was about 20 minutes long, and it talked about all the ways that they do this, and it was just fascinating that they were so looking at efficiency, because they could be effective at a higher cost, but they looked at the efficient as that's the only way we're going to grow effectively. So they would kill certain areas of the country if they couldn't get to efficiency. This comes from the not-for-profit space, and I find this in government as well, is that span of control in companies tends to go flatter and flatter and flatter over time. In the not-for-profit space, most span of control kind of looks like a telephone pole after a while, because you want people to be happy and you want them to do good work, but that means that they build more layers than they need to try and keep everybody happy. And I observed this even in the for-profit world, where a retail company had 7 people in the pathway in a perishable department, 1 person doing all the work, and that person reported to 6 other people. And it was just a wildly inefficient and ineffective way to do it. And so government and not-for-profit tend to go the very narrow piece, and they get real frustrated, at least with me, when I start talking about, you know, if you really want to reach more people, you might want to flatten that organization out and get more people actually doing the work. And finally, and this is I'll call it a funny story, but it really isn't. I've put together 2 different sourcing organizations inside of large companies. And in the first one of my jobs was to go and talk to every senior leader about their sourcing activities. And the pencil story is one where the SVP of HR for this company looked at me and said, no, we want to keep that because that's really the only fun thing our people have to do is maybe buy pencils. And my eyes got as big as saucers, and I said, I didn't say it because I didn't want to get fired right there, but like, okay, if that's if that's really what's going on, we've got larger problems than just sourcing. But it was a way to really understand why people hold on to things that are inefficient and ineffective because they think it makes their team happy. So we had to prove that it didn't. It had nothing to do with the happiness of their folks. So my conclusion to everybody would be, if you're a big company, small company, solopreneur, start asking the questions about what are they focusing on? And if they're not focusing first on how do they drive their top line, they've got work to do. Because if they can't focus there, they're going to lose focus as they get everywhere else. On the other side of the equation, if they're only focusing on expense management, they're missing the point of why they're in this business in the first place. And so with that, Rob, I want to open it up for any questions, and I can stop presenting, but I can't see any comments in the chat. So you might want to share those if there's questions in there for me.
Yeah, there was, Bruce had a comment about Quick Trip deploying a similar strategy that you're talking about when, and I know Quick Trip a little bit too. They're very good at evaluating their process. And you talk about trying to increase basket, and you know, if you've paid attention about the food offerings that they've been providing, you know, now doing fried chicken, meals on the go.
Yep.
They're not just about the gas anymore.
No, and that's a,
What
Oh,
I
go
had
ahead.
heard was similar to what Craig was talking about with the dollar store or whatever the name of it was in their locations. I'm hearing what Quick Trip's doing is as they poke out in the areas where they're not or not a lot of, they'll take these towns where maybe the competition might have dropped one location into the town, and they're dropping two into the town at either end of town. Now they've got two. They're not just making a trip there to stock one store, they're stocking two, and they'll start doing that in other nearby towns. So they drop two in, not the real tiny towns, but more of a still smaller town, not a mid-sized town. But that's what I'm hearing. I've heard about that.
And they are, and they're actually deploying what I always call the Walmart approach, is that Walmart couldn't afford the high cost of real estate in the downtown areas of secondary towns, you know, the Rochesters and places like that. So they'd put it out on the fringes. And what they found was that they could draw both from inside the town and from the rural areas, where some of the rural people didn't mind going into town, but to save money, it's like, oh, I don't have to deal with all the traffic. I don't have to do all that stuff. And Quick Trip, I think, has found the same thing, is that not only can I get people when they're out and about on either side of town, but I now draw from further out. And what Rob was saying about the food offerings, the first aspect is I'm driving traffic because I'm appealing to a broader set. But then once they're here, I want to get them to buy fresher food, different types of food, drinks, all those things that they make higher margin on than they make on their gasoline. And I did some work with 7-Eleven years ago that was their main thing. One of the reasons they wanted to go straight to convenience and get away from gas with 7-Eleven was they couldn't make money on gas. But they made so much money on the stuff inside that if they got rid of the traffic generated by the gas, would they make more money? And the answer was yes.
What other comments, suggestions, feedback do we have for Craig? I know for me, I'm going to butcher it, Craig, is the PCR.
Yes.
I kind of understood the gist of it, and I think that's a great way to kind of look at your business, is how much of it do you actually own in your space.
Yep.
I think it's a great piece to try to figure out, learn, and utilize.
Well, and I will tell you that with a lot of businesses, I do a 2x2 matrix that lays out all their sales, and it breaks it into 4 quadrants. Somebody who buys a little bit of a little bit, and those are kind of your transactional customers. The people who buy a lot of a little bit, and those are, you know, they're your volume customers. Then people that buy a little of a lot, they're your potential customers because they're buying a broad array, but they're not at the volume level yet. And the key is to get people buying a lot of a lot, because then they're buying breadth and they're buying depth. And those are your strategic customers, are the ones you think can get there. And so I help companies plot the course for how do I move my people that are buying a lot of a little into buying more by identifying, to your point, what else am I missing out on? And the ones buying a little of a lot, is it because they're small, or is it because they buy from a lot of people because they think that's an effective way to do it? And then how do I problem solve to get them to say, look, concentrate more of your stuff with me, and I can give you better pricing, more efficiencies, more of all the other things that you're looking for. So yeah, the PCR piece is very important for businesses to look at.
Hey, Craig, this is Brad.
Yes.
So as you're talking, something that comes to mind, and I don't know if it would be a fourth pillar, or if it's just somehow runs across all those. You know, when you're talking about increasing the top line, or maybe it's just the top line, that concentration level is important, because you can talk about taking a customer and increasing their volume, but if then all of a sudden they become 20% or more of your business, you know, that's not a good thing either. So I don't know how you view that or how you work that in.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And a friend of mine who worked for a printing company years ago was doing a lot of work on this, and I was helping him build the sales process to combat that. Because what happens is that companies that have clients who get to be a fairly large percentage, so 20% is kind of a good metric, a good rule of thumb, is they assign that to one person. And because it's like, oh, we can make a lot of money on that account. And what I say instead is build your relationship at 3 or 4 levels inside that company, because you don't want them leaving, or you want signals that they're leaving long before they actually do. So I recommend somebody to take care of the day-to-day business, to make sure that the trains run on time, that product's getting delivered. The next person to start looking at what are the risks and threats inside the organization. Third, what business could we get that might take our business even higher with them, even though it might take them to 30% of our business. And then what I call a white knight, somebody that's connected at a very senior level, that if something starts going sideways at those other 3 levels, they can white knight in and maybe save the business. The second piece of that is to give the person that's in charge of that business development metrics, so that they have to build a larger client base, because they have to be responsible for replacing that business. And if they think, well, I've got to take care of this big customer, it's like, yeah, but if we lose them, you get fired. So you want them to start building a pipeline of customers and clients that are both inside that big company and outside. So then you want to make sure that all that business is transferable. So yes, you have to mitigate the risk of what happens if you've got a customer that becomes a major driver in your business. That's a great point.
Hey, Craig, how much of, when you think about increasing basket, do you feel like M&A plays into that? Meaning, like, I think about Scott's example, and for those that don't know, I'm going to butcher a little bit, but Scott does a great job of the 911 call recordings, and he was talking to us a little bit about body cam for police officers, and that's a pretty cutthroat business. So instead, my thought is, or my question is, when do you assess that there's a need or a complementary service that you can add to your offerings, but you don't necessarily want the added capital or expense to bring that service on, and instead go out and buy one of your competitors per se? What sort of analysis do you need to run to see if M&A is really a good opportunity for you in your business?
So a couple of things. The first is, so let's stay on Scott's issue here with, I own the 911 recording and translation stuff, or I'm a really big player in that. The first question I would ask is, what technologies exist that could chase me out of that? And I'd start exploring those technologies, because you're going to find things that are so far afield that, no, that's never going to happen. But, the Kodak never thought that photography was ever going to go away, yet digital photography and your smartphone has pretty much killed traditional photography, at least for the general public. The second is exactly what you're talking about. So let's say you had a low margin segment like the body cams. What I might do is find a body cam partner that they do that And you create an arrangement, not a joint venture, but that if you ever find somebody that wants that, you bring them in so that they do all the work and you get credit for finding a solution, and maybe you get a little taste of what they're doing. Or it's a reciprocal arrangement that if they've got a contract for body cam, bring me in to help pitch on the 911 recording and dictation. That way you can explore multiple relationships with multiple companies. And I know, Scott, you're a little bit more concentrated geographically, but if you look at it from a national scope, now you can get into other markets with other players. And when you find one that has got kind of an emerging technology in body cameras that nobody's ever heard of, that's when you might take a risk and say, I'm going to buy that technology to see if I can deploy that and enhance my margins because my infrastructure costs might be less. So I think that answers your question, Rob, and maybe not perfectly, but that's kind of how I look at things. Is, you partner first with people you can trust that might be a little bit outside your frame of expertise. Then you would look at buying the ones that actually can do it better, that you might be able to roll out on a broader scale. And then you keep looking for what's the technology that's going to erase my competitive advantage. And maybe I should start looking at buying that technology and building or rebuilding my competitive advantage.
No question to, I like what you're saying. Where's the or at the start of that response, it was something to the effect of, where's the industry going to go or what's going to happen?
Yep.
I never in a million years would have envisioned my parents, who were in their mid to late 80s, ever ordering groceries online. They are the last people that would ever, but with the help of my sister, they go to the grocery store for 100 years, Super Value or Red Owl back in the day, flashback there. And yeah, now technology has changed, and it will continue to in every industry. So it's a valid point.
Yeah, and it's interesting because most monumental change comes from outside the industry. Look at Blockbuster. They owned the rental movie market, and they turned down buying Netflix because they didn't see streaming as an opportunity. It's like, oh my God, how can 2020 hindsight is great, but and Netflix has been much more nimble, and they've even had some of their own distractions, like when they went from kind of the CD mail and mail back to a full streaming. They got a lot of pushback, but they stayed the course because they saw the future in streaming. And I don't know if you guys know who Mike Rowe is, but I was reading something he had written today about somebody was kind of lamenting that his new show's on Discovery Plus, and now you want to charge me money to watch your show. And he said, well, you're probably paying a cable company or a satellite company to watch my shows today, and you're probably paying way more than you think. So if I can give you this much content for $7, $8 a month, do you really need cable anymore? And it's like, well, that's the right question to ask, because Rob knows this, and a couple other people on the call know this as well. My wife and I recently bought a new home, and it's getting built. So you can see I'm in a hotel room. You might not be able to see that, but I'm in a hotel room as we have temporary quarters. And we were never going to cut the cord because there were too many advantages of having access to all that stuff. But as we wired the house, the guy wiring it said, why don't we just wire for an HD antenna for local channels and don't worry about cable as much, because then you can stream everything. And when he said it, we poo-pooed it. And now 6 weeks later, we're like, well, we could stream this and this and this, and we were streaming all these things. Well, now let's do a cost-benefit analysis. So now we're at least thinking about it, and chances are we'll start with, okay, we're going to stream almost everything instead of having cable or a satellite dish. So yes, to your point on your parents, Scott, even old dogs like me can figure out how to change.
I did a house a couple years ago that I'm in right now, and that was right at the crux of streaming was starting to really happen.
Yep.
And I got my house wired with what do you call it? The regular coaxial cable or whatever.
Yep,
So you can hook your TV in every room.
yep,
I got these jacks all over my house. I'm not using any of them.
yep. Yeah, and it's, I remember when we bought the condo that we just sold, it was wired for what they called Cat 5, and I'll be honest, we have no idea what that is, but it was essentially Ethernet plugs everywhere. And when they went to wireless, the need for that all disappeared. And it's amazing the pace of change. So,
Happens quicker than you think.
yep. Well, listen, everybody, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to me, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I think.
There you go. Well, Craig, I appreciate your time. If there's anything from anyone else, quick, raise your hands. And with that, let's go ahead and we can get back to our Tuesday. Let's pray for a good smooth transition tomorrow. Nothing chaotic, and looking forward to seeing all of you later on. Give me a buzz if I could be of any help. And again, thanks, Craig, for all the great content and way to make us think on a Tuesday.